The first time I laughed when Miller whipped me, I saw something break in his eyes. Not guilt, not mercy, but something far more dangerous. Confusion, fear, even. And that's when I understood. My laughter was a weapon sharper than any knife, more terrifying than any threat. It was a sound that said I knew something he didn't, that I existed in a mental space he couldn't reach, that his violence was accomplishing nothing except counting down to his own destruction. My name is Jonah, and they called me mad for laughing at pain. But I wasn't mad, I was counting. Counting every strike, every insult, every cruelty. And with each count, I was one step closer to the night when Miller's world would burn in water. Music. When flames would dance in rain, when everything he'd built on our suffering would turn to ash, and his screams would echo across a plantation lit by impossible fire. He never understood why I laughed. Not until that storm-soaked night, when his house ignited like a torch in the downpour, when water fed fire instead of quenching it, when he finally realized that my laughter had never been madness. It had been anticipation. It had been the sound of a man perfecting a secret weapon, testing its power in his mind with every beating, preparing for the moment when theory would become devastating reality. This is the story of how a man tried to break me with violence, and how I destroyed him with chemistry, patience, and a smile that concealed calculations he couldn't comprehend. I was born in 1827 on a rice plantation in the South Carolina Low Country, in a region where the land was more water than earth, where mosquitoes bred diseases that killed white and black alike, where enslaved people worked in conditions so brutal that life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. My mother was named Patience, a cruel irony given how little patience the system showed her, and she worked in the rice fields from before dawn until after dusk, her feet perpetually wet, her hands perpetually raw. I remember her singing. She sang work songs with African rhythms that our ancestors had brought across the ocean. Songs in languages that were being forgotten, music, but that still carried power in their melodies. She sang to make the work pass faster, to communicate with other workers, to keep some part of herself alive that slavery couldn't touch. Remember? Music. Jonah, she told me when I was perhaps 7 years old enough to understand but too young to fully comprehend. They can own our bodies, but they can't own what's in here. She tapped my chest, or here, she tapped my head. You keep your mind free. You keep learning, watching, thinking. That's the freedom they can't take. I tried to hold on to those words, but when I was 8 years old, the master died, and his estate was liquidated to pay debts. My mother and I were separated on the auction block in Charleston. I was sold to a merchant named Henderson, who needed dock labor. My mother was sold to a plantation further inland. I screamed for her as we were taken in different directions, and the last thing I heard was her voice singing. Even in that moment of ultimate horror, she was singing. I never saw her again. I carried her songs and her words with me, but the physical presence of her was gone. Torn away by a system that didn't recognize family bonds between enslaved people, because that would acknowledge our humanity. Henderson was a shipping merchant who owned several warehouses near the Charleston docks. He used enslaved labor for all the physical work, loading and unloading cargo, maintaining the warehouses, hauling goods through the city. It was brutal work, the kind that broke bodies young. Music. But it was also educational in ways that plantation labor wasn't. The docks were a crossroads of the world. Ships came from Europe, from the Caribbean, music from Africa, from South American ports. I saw sailors from dozens of countries, heard languages I couldn't identify, watched the flow of global commerce that enriched Charleston's white elite, while enslaved people provided the muscle to make it all function. Henderson believed that basic literacy in his enslaved workers was useful for efficiency. We needed to identify cargo by written labels, understand manifests, follow written instructions. This was unusual. Most slaveholders forbade literacy, music, as dangerous. But Henderson was pragmatic. He taught his enslaved dock workers enough reading and arithmetic to be useful while still maintaining control through violence, and the constant threat of being sold to the brutal rice or cotton plantations. I absorbed everything I could. I learned to read beyond the basic level, Henderson taught. Secretly studying newspapers that shipping merchants left behind, listening to educated men discuss business and politics, watching clerks calculate cargo values and cargo weights. My mind was hungry for knowledge the way my body was often hungry for food, and the docks provided endless opportunities to learn. Among the regular sailors who frequented Charleston was a Greek man named Demetrius Katsaros. Everyone called him Dimitri. He was perhaps 60 years old, weathered by decades at sea, with skin like tanned leather and hands that were missing 2 fingers from some long-ago accident. He worked on merchant vessels that traveled between Mediterranean ports in the Americas. And he had a reputation as someone who'd been everywhere, seen everything, and could tell stories that would last entire nights. I met him in 1849 when I was 22 years old. I was helping unload cargo from his ship, barrels of olive oil from Greece, crates of wine, bales of cloth. Dmitri was supervising the unloading, and he noticed me reading the manifest to verify the cargo. "You read Greek letters?" he asked, surprised. The manifest had some Greek words mixed with English. "No, sir, just English, but I can recognize some patterns." "Smart boy, most slaves can't read at all." "How'd you learn?" "Master Henderson teaches basic reading for dock work." I expanded on that when I could. He studied me with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "You're curious. I like curious people. They're the ones who survive." He glanced around to make sure no one was close enough to hear. "You want to learn something interesting, something that could be useful someday?" "Always, sir." That began a relationship that would last 18 months until Dimitri's ship stopped, including Charleston on its route. Whenever his vessel was in port, usually for a week or 2 at a time, several times a year, he'd seek me out and teach me things. He taught me basic Greek, not to speak it fluently, but to understand the roots of words, the way language connected to science and philosophy. He taught me about Mediterranean history, about ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen before America existed. He taught me about chemistry, about how substances combined and reacted, about the principles underlying fire and combustion. "Everything burn," he said one afternoon. We were sitting on empty crates near his ship, to ostensibly taking a break but really having a lesson. But different things burn in different ways. Wood burns with air. Oil burns hotter. Some substances burn with what's inside them. "They don't need air at all." "That doesn't make sense," I said. "Fire needs air. Everyone knows that normal fire needs air." "Yes, but there are substances that carry their own oxidizer, their own air in a way." The Byzantine knew this. They created what we called Greek fire, liquid fire, fire that burned on water that couldn't be put out by normal means. Why would you need fire that burns on water? Naval warfare. Imagine you're a Byzantine ship and enemy vessels are approaching. You throw pots of Greek fire onto their decks. The substance ignites, spreads, and even when they throw water on it, even when the sea itself washes over it, it keeps burning. Spreads even. Music. It was the most terrifying weapon of its time. What was it made of? He looked around carefully, then leaned closer. The exact formula was a closely guarded state secret. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the formula was supposedly destroyed so enemies couldn't use it. But scholars and sailors have tried to recreate it for centuries. I've spent 30 years studying accounts, testing combinations, trying to rediscover what was lost. Did you succeed partially? I've created mixtures that burn on water, that spread with moisture, that stick to surfaces and can't be easily extinguished. Not exactly the Byzantine formula. I don't have access to some ingredients they used, but similar enough to be effective. Why are you telling me this? Music. Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, watching ships move in the harbor. Because I've been all over this cursed world, boy. I've seen slavery everywhere. Africa, the Caribbean, here in your American South, and I've seen slave revolts. Most fail because masters have better weapons, more organization, backing of law and government. But knowledge is a weapon they can't see coming. Information is power they don't know you have. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, worn, water-stained, filled with his handwriting in Greek and English. I'm getting old, Jonah. This ship is probably my last voyage before retirement. I want this knowledge to survive. I'm giving it to you, not the notebook itself. That would be too dangerous if discovered, but the information in it. Over the next months, during his final voyages to Charleston, Dmitri taught me everything he'd learned about creating fire that defied normal rules. The principles of self-sustaining combustion, the ingredients, pine resin collected at specific times, music sulfur from sulfur springs, quicklime, saltpeter if available, tallow to bind it all together, the proportions that made the difference between failure and success, the methods of preparation, storage, and deployment. You'll probably never use this, he said during our final meeting in early 1851. Most people never need such knowledge, but if you ever do, if you ever face a situation where normal resistance would fail, but something unexpected might succeed, you'll have this weapon in your mind. Music. Thank you, Dimitri, I won't forget. Good. And Jonah, one more thing. If you do use this knowledge someday, make sure it looks like an accident or an act of God. Fire that burns on water is impossible, so people will assume supernatural causes rather than human agency. Use their disbelief as camouflage. That was the last time I saw him. His ship sailed, and I heard later that he'd retired to a small Greek island. I wondered if he ever knew that his teaching would eventually destroy a plantation and an overseer's entire career. I might never have used what Dimitri taught me if my life had continued on the Charleston docks. But in late 1851, Henderson died suddenly, a heart attack that killed him within minutes. His estate went to his son, who'd been living in Boston, and who immediately decided to liquidate everything and return north. That included selling Henderson's enslaved workers. The auction took place in January 1852. I was 24 years old, strong from dock work, literate and skilled with numbers. I fetched a good price, $1,400, purchased by an agent representing Malcolm Sterling, who owned a large tobacco plantation in North Carolina. I was chained and transported north with 5 other newly purchased enslaved people. The journey took Music a week, mostly on foot, sleeping in whatever shelter the traders could find or afford. We were considered valuable property, so we were fed adequately and not abused. Music damaged goods brought lower resale value if the sale fell through. We arrived at Sterling Plantation on a cold February morning. The plantation was vast, over 2,000 acres dedicated to tobacco cultivation with perhaps 80 enslaved people working the fields, barns, and big house. It was a different world from Charleston. The docks had been cosmopolitan, connected to global trade, Music with enslaved people having at least some variety in their work and circumstances. The plantation was isolated, insular, its entire existence focused on one crop and the brutal labor required to cultivate it. Master Sterling himself was rarely present. He lived in Raleigh, managing business interests there, visiting the plantation perhaps 4 or 5 times a year to inspect operations and collect profits. The actual management was left to his overseer, Amos Miller. I met Miller my first day at Sterling Plantation. He was 38 years old, built like a bull with a neck as thick as my thigh and hands that looked like they could crush rocks. His face was permanently music red from sun exposure, from alcohol, from the constant rage that seemed to simmer just beneath his surface. He inspected us new purchases like we were horses, checking our teeth, making us demonstrate our strength by lifting heavy objects, asking questions about our work history. "Charleston docks," he said when he learned my background. "City slave, probably lazy. Think you're better than field hands. Well, you're not. You're tobacco now. You'll work from sun up to sundown, and you'll learn to respect the system here." "Understand?" "Yes, sir." "You can read, can't you?" Henderson taught his slaves basic music reading. He said it with contempt, like literacy was a disease. "Yes, sir." "Well, forget that here. No reading, no writing, no thinking you're special because you know music letters. You're property, and property doesn't need literacy. It needs obedience." He assigned me to the tobacco fields under the supervision of a senior field and named Daniel, who'd worked at Sterling Plantation for 20 years and knew every aspect of tobacco cultivation. The work was brutal, but not immediately unbearable. Tobacco required careful, patient labor, planting seedlings in spring, tending the growing plants through summer, harvesting leaves in specific sequences as music matured, hanging the leaves to dry in massive barns. It was work that could be done badly or done well, music, and the difference mattered economically. Miller's management philosophy was simple: extract maximum productivity through fear and violence. He walked the fields, music constantly, whip in hand, ready to punish any perceived laziness or incompetence. He set impossible quotas and then beat people for failing to meet them. He withheld food as punishment. He separated families as discipline. He made sure everyone understood that suffering could always get worse, that there was no bottom to the cruelty he could inflict. But he wasn't indiscriminate about violence. He was strategic. He beat people just enough to instill fear, but not so much as to render them unable to work. He was a craftsman of terror, honing his techniques over years of practice. The enslaved community at Sterling Plantation lived in constant fear of him. People whispered about him, shared stories of his cruelties, warned newcomers about behaviors that triggered his rage. The general survival strategy was invisibility. Work efficiently, but not so well that you stood out. Never talk back. Never show defiance, never give him an excuse. I tried to follow that strategy for my first weeks at the plantation. I learned the tobacco work from Daniel, who was a patient teacher despite his own exhaustion and suffering. I kept my head down. I worked steadily. I avoided Miller's attention as much as possible, but Miller had a way of finding people to torment. And as a newcomer from the city, I was an obvious target for establishing dominance. My first real encounter with Miller came in early March, about 6 weeks after my arrival. I was working in the tobacco seedling beds, delicate work requiring careful handling of young plants. I was moving down a row, transplanting seedlings from the dense starting bed to space positions where they could grow when I accidentally damaged one pulled too hard on a delicate stem which snapped. It was a minor mistake, the kind that happened constantly, one damaged seedling among thousands. But Miller was watching from the edge of the field and he saw an opportunity. You. His voice cut across the field. Get over here. I walked toward him, heart already starting to pound. I could feel the attention of every other worker shifting toward us, the particular electric tension that preceded punishment. You just killed one of Master Sterling's plants, Miller said, his voice deceptively calm. Do you know how much money that represents? No, sir, I'm sorry. It was an accident, and his voice rose. Carelessness costs money. Master Sterling doesn't pay me to tolerate careless slaves. He grabbed me by the shirt and music backhanded me across the face. The blow was hard enough that I tasted blood immediately, my lips splitting against my teeth. 10 lashes, he announced to the assembled workers. Let this be a lesson about carelessness. He dragged me to the whipping post, a permanent fixture at the edge of the tobacco field, positioned so that workers could watch punishments while they worked. It was worn smooth from contact with countless backs. The ground around it stained dark from blood that had soaked into the soil over years. Miller stripped my shirt off roughly, then tied my wrists to the top of the post, stretching my arms above my head until I was almost standing on tiptoes. The position left my back fully exposed and vulnerable. Count them, he ordered, pulling out his leather strap. Count them loud so everyone can hear. The first strike hit my back and I gasped. 1. The pain was sharp. Immediate, worse than I'd expected, but as the pain bloomed across my back, something strange happened in my mind. I thought about Dmitri, about his lessons, about the formula for Greek fire that I'd memorized. I thought about the pine trees I'd noticed surrounding the plantation, music lobley pines that produced copious resin. I thought about the sulfur springs Daniel had mentioned existed a few miles away. I thought about the materials that might be available on this plantation. And as these thoughts filled my mind, pushing aside the immediate pain, something rose in my throat, not a scream, a laugh. It started as a small sound, a breathy chuckle that might have been mistaken for a gasp, but as the second strike hit, the laugh became more distinct. 2, I said and laughed quietly. Miller paused, confused. Why are you laughing? I didn't answer, couldn't answer. The laugh was partly involuntary, partly strategic, partly genuine dark humor at the absurdity of being beaten for a broken plant stem, while planning to eventually burn down the entire plantation. The third strike hit harder. I laughed louder, the sound clear and unsettling. Stop laughing. Miller's voice had an edge of fear now. He'd beaten hundreds of enslaved people over the years. They screamed, cried, begged, cursed quietly after he'd walked away. But laughing, that was new. That was disturbing. I didn't stop. With each strike, 4, 5, 6. The laughter continued, not hysterical or performative, just steady, quiet, deeply unsettling laughter that said, I was somewhere else in my mind, that his violence wasn't reaching me the way he intended. By the 8th strike, Miller had lost count, was just hitting me repeatedly, trying to make the laugh stop, but it continued, steady and maddening. What's wrong with you? He shouted. Why are you laughing? I turned my head to look at him, blood running from my split lip, my back on fire with pain. And I laughed directly at him, a sound that clearly said I knew something he didn't, that I was anticipating something he couldn't imagine. He hit me several more times, well past the original count of 10, then threw down the whip in disgust. Something's wrong with this one. He's mad, completely insane. He cut the ropes holding me to the post, and I collapsed, unable to stand. Get him out of here. Back to the quarters. He's useless for the rest of the day. Music. 2 other enslaved men helped me back to the quarters, rough wooden buildings where we slept on pallets with minimal privacy or comfort. They laid me face down on my pallet, and an older woman named Aunt Cecily came with water and cloth to clean the wounds. "Why'd you laugh, boy?" she asked quietly as she gently cleaned my torn back. "That just made him worse, made him beat you longer." "I don't know," I said, which was partly true. It just came out, thinking about other things while he was hitting me. And it seemed funny somehow. Funny. Getting beaten is funny. No, but I struggled to articulate it. The fact that he thinks he's breaking me while he's actually just giving me motivation, that's funny in a dark way. She was quiet for a moment. "You're a strange one, Jonah. Be careful. Miller doesn't like things he doesn't understand. You've made yourself a puzzle to him, and he's going to keep trying to solve you, which means more beatings." She was right. Over the following weeks and months, Miller's attention focused on me, music, in a way that went beyond normal overseer vigilance. I'd become an obsession for him, a challenge. He wanted to understand the laugh to stop it, to prove he could break me like he'd broken everyone else. He found excuses to punish me frequently, minor mistakes that he'd normally ignore, perceived slowness in my work, even just not liking the expression on my face. And each time when the whip or his fist struck, I laughed. It wasn't always easy. The pain was real and terrible. But I trained myself to associate the pain with my secret plan, with the formula I was perfecting in my mind. Music, with the mental image of Miller's world burning. The pain became connected to anticipation, and the anticipation produced that strange, unsettling laugh. The laugh became my reputation. I was crazy Jonah, the one who laughs, the one who's not right in his head. Other enslaved people gave me space, unsure what to make of me. Some thought I actually was insane. Others suspected there was something else going on, but didn't know what. Miller became increasingly disturbed by my reaction to punishment. He'd beaten enslaved people for 15 years, had refined his techniques. Music knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain and fear, but I was responding wrong, and it was eating at him. "Why do you laugh?" he'd demand, his face inches from mine after beating me. "What's so damn funny?" I just look at him with blood running down my face and laugh softly. That same maddening sound that said I knew secrets he couldn't access, that I existed in a mental space beyond his reach. It drove him increasingly insane with rage. Meanwhile, I was systematically working on my real project. I began gathering materials slowly and carefully, never taking enough of anything to be noticed, always having plausible explanations if questioned. Pine resin was everywhere. The plantation was bordered by massive pine forests, and the trees naturally produced sap that hardened into resin. I'd collect small amounts during moments when I wasn't directly observed, claiming I needed to repair tools with the sticky substance, or that I was treating minor injuries, or just gathering it as I walked past trees on the way to work. If you're captivated by Jonah's methodical planning and that unsettling laugh that conceals careful calculation, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe. We're uncovering stories of resistance through intelligence, patience, and chemistry. Sulfur was harder. Daniel had mentioned sulfur springs a few miles from the plantation in a marshy area that no one visited regularly. On Sundays, when we had a few hours of rest and some freedom to move around the immediate area, I'd sometimes disappear into the woods. Other enslaved people thought I was going off to pray or to be alone with my madness. Actually, I was hiking to the sulfur springs, collecting the yellow powder that accumulated around the edges, storing it in a small leather pouch I'd sewn from scraps. Quick lime was used on the plantation for various agricultural purposes, soil treatment, processing, construction. I'd steal tiny amounts from the storage shed, claiming I needed it for specific tasks that no one ever verified. Over months, those tiny thefts accumulated into a usable quantity. Tallow animal fat I could obtain from the kitchen. Aunt Cecily, who tended my back after that first beating, worked in the kitchen. She didn't know what I was doing, but she'd slip me scraps of tallow when I asked, thinking I needed it for treating leather or wounds, and in a hollow tree deep in the forest, a massive oak that had been struck by lightning and burned from the inside, leaving a perfect hidden cavity. I began mixing and testing. The first attempts were complete failures. The mixture wouldn't ignite properly, or it would burn but extinguish immediately when water touched it, or the proportions were wrong and it just produced thick smoke without real flame. I worked on the problem like a scientist, which, in a way, I was an enslaved chemist working without equipment, without safety measures, without reference materials beyond what I'd memorized from Dimitri's teachings and my own observations. I adjusted proportions carefully. More resin made it stickier but less reactive. More sulfur increased reactivity but made it unstable. The quick line was crucial. It reacted violently with water, producing heat that could reignite the mixture even after initial combustion. After dozens of failures, I achieved my first success. A tiny amount of the mixture placed in a leaf and sealed with wax ignited when I broke the seal and exposed it to air. Then when I splashed it with water from a stream instead of extinguishing, the flame spread, fed by the quick lime's reaction with water, reignited by the heat, sustained by the resin and sulfur. It was beautiful, terrifying, but beautiful. I'd recreated something thought lost to history using only materials available in a North Carolina forest and knowledge taught to me by a Greek sailor who'd made it his life's work to understand ancient weapons. I immediately extinguished the test flame and buried the evidence. This knowledge was too dangerous to let anyone discover before I was ready to use it. But now I knew it was possible. Greek fire could be made and a plantation could burn even in a rainstorm. I began producing the mixture in larger quantities, always working in tiny batches to avoid detection, storing the finished product in small clay pots that I'd made myself from riverbank clay and fired in small hidden fires. Each pot was sealed with wax to keep the contents stable and protected from moisture. I created hiding places throughout the plantation and the surrounding forest, dozens of spots where pots could be concealed. A hollow in a tree trunk here, a buried cache beneath a distinctive rock there. A gap in the foundation of an unused shed. Each location was memorized, mapped in my mind, ready to be accessed when the time came. The work took months, gathering materials, mixing batches, testing small amounts, creating pots, hiding them strategically, all while continuing to work in the tobacco fields, enduring Miller's increasingly violent attempts to stop my laughter, maintaining the appearance of being crazy Jonah, while actually being the most focused and purposeful I'd ever been in my life. Miller's obsession with me grew. The laugh haunted him. He'd increased the frequency and severity of beatings, convinced that eventually I'd break, that the laugh would stop and be replaced by the screams and tears he was used to. But it never stopped. If anything, it got more pronounced as my preparations neared completion. Each beating was just another mark on my mental calendar, another countdown toward the night when Miller would finally understand what the laugh had meant all along. Other enslaved people began to see my laugh differently. A man named Samuel approached me one evening in late summer. He was about 30, a field worker who'd been at Sterling Plantation for 8 years, who bore scars from Miller's whip across his entire back. "Jonah," he said quietly, sitting beside me outside the quarters, "people are scared of you. Think you've lost your mind, but I don't think you're crazy. I think you're hiding something." "What makes you say that?" "Because I've watched you when Miller isn't around. You work efficiently, you speak clearly. You remember things. That's not a madman. That's someone playing a role." He paused. "What are you planning?" I looked at him for a long moment, weighing the risk of telling him versus the benefit of having allies. "If I told you I was preparing something that could hurt Miller badly, destroy his career, ruin him, but that it would be dangerous for everyone involved, would you want to know more?" "Depends. How dangerous? And how badly would it hurt him?" "Life-threatening, dangerous. And it would completely destroy him, his reputation, his livelihood, everything he's built here." Samuel was quiet, staring at the tobacco fields in the distance. "I've been here 8 years. Watched Miller beat my friends to death, watched him sell away families for pure spite. Watched him enjoy causing pain like it's a hobby. If there's a chance to destroy him, really destroy him, not just resist in ways that get more people hurt, then yes, I want to know. Even if the risk is that we might die if it fails. Jonah, we're already dying here, just slowly. If I have a choice between dying while trying to hurt him back and dying after years more of this, I choose trying." So I told him, not everything, not initially, but enough. That I'd learned to create fire that burned on water, that I'd been preparing materials for months, that I was planning to use a massive rainstorm as cover to burn Miller's house and the tobacco barns, music destroying the year's crop and Miller's career in one night. Samuel stared at me in disbelief. "Fire that burns on water? That's impossible." "So everyone will think, which is why they'll assume it's lightning strike or an act of God rather than arson. Our plausible deniability comes from everyone knowing it's impossible." "Show me." That night I took Samuel to my hidden laboratory in the hollow tree. I showed him my stores of materials, demonstrated a small test of the Greek fire, let him watch as water spread the flame instead of extinguishing it. His face in the firelight showed wonder and fear. "My God, you actually did it. Created something from myths and legends, from chemistry and patience. And now I need help. I have maybe 30 pots of this hidden around the plantation. But to use them all effectively, I need people to place them at key locations simultaneously. Can't do it alone, would take too long, might get caught. Need 3 or 4 others who can be trusted absolutely and who are willing to take the risk. I know people, James, Thomas, and Benjamin, all field workers, all have suffered under Miller. All would take this risk if they believed it could work. Over the next weeks, I quietly brought those 3 others into the plan. James was a younger man, perhaps 22, who'd watched Miller beat his father to death 2 years earlier over a broken tool. Thomas was in his 30s, methodical and careful, a man who thought through consequences before acting. Benjamin was the oldest of our group at 45, a man who'd survived 3 different plantations and who understood both the risks and potential rewards of what we were planning. I showed them all the demonstration, the Greek fire burning on water, the way it stuck to surfaces and couldn't be easily extinguished. They all had the same initial reaction, shock that it was possible, followed by grim satisfaction at what it could accomplish. "When do we do this?" James asked after seeing the demonstration. "We wait for the right conditions," I explained. "Need a major storm, heavy rain that makes everyone think fire is impossible. Need the tobacco barns to be full. They fill up in October after harvest. Need Master Sterling to be away. He visits in November to inspect the finished product. So late October is perfect timing of music, and we need to be patient. Can't rush this. One mistake, one person caught, music, and it all falls apart. So we wait until October," Thomas said. "That's still 2 months away. 2 months to refine our plan, memorize our roles, prepare mentally. This isn't something we can rush." Benjamin spoke up. "What happens after? Even if we succeed, we're still enslaved here. Miller might be destroyed, but we'll still be property." "True, but conditions might improve under a new overseer. Most can't be worse than Miller. And in the chaos, some might escape north, and even if nothing material changes for us, we'll have struck a blow. Prove that enslaved people aren't helpless, that we can fight back with intelligence instead of just violence. I'm in," James said immediately. "Me too," Thomas agreed. Benjamin was quiet longer, then nodded. "I've lived through too much cruelty. If I die trying to hurt Miller back, that's better than dying without ever resisting." Music. We spent September planning in detail. I created a map in my mind of where each pot was hidden and which buildings were the highest priority music targets. Miller's house was obvious. Destroying his home would be symbolically powerful. The 3 tobacco barns were critical. They held the entire year's harvest, and burning them would cause maximum economic damage. The equipment sheds and processing buildings were secondary targets. We divided responsibilities. Samuel would handle Miller's house, 3 pots placed on the roof and around the foundation. James and Thomas would split the 3 tobacco barns between them, multiple pots for each massive structure. Benjamin would take the equipment sheds and storage buildings. I would coordinate timing and serve as witness. I wanted to see Miller's face when his world burned. The night of October 18th, 1852 brought exactly what we'd been waiting for. A massive storm rolled in from the Atlantic, the trailing edge of what might have been a hurricane that had hit the coast, music, and was now moving inland. The sky turned that particular shade of greenish-black that predicted serious weather. The wind picked up to tree-bending strength and the rain began as a light drizzle that everyone knew would become a downpour. Perfect conditions. Everyone would shelter inside. Visibility would be near zero, and most importantly, everyone would assume fire was impossible in such weather, which meant our arson would look like supernatural event or natural disaster. That afternoon, as the storm was building, but before it reached full strength, Miller found his final excuse to beat me. I'd been moving more slowly than usual, still recovering from the beating he'd given me 2 weeks earlier that had cracked my ribs, and he decided it was deliberate laziness. "So, you think you can slack off because a storm's coming?" he yelled at me across the tobacco field. "You think weather gives you an excuse to be lazy?" "No, sir. I'm working as fast as I can to the post. Maybe a whipping will motivate you properly." The other workers stopped what they were doing, forced to watch as Miller dragged me to the whipping post. The wind was already strong, whipping the tobacco plants into a frenzy. The sky was dark despite it being mid-afternoon. The first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Miller tied my wrist to the post roughly, stretching my arms overhead. He was breathing hard, his face red with rage and anticipation. He genuinely enjoyed this, looked forward to it. 20 lashes, he announced, and this time, by God, you're going to scream instead of laugh. I'm going to finally break whatever's broken inside your head. The first strike hit as the rain began in earnest. The pain was sharp and immediate, but I was so focused on what would happen in just a few hours that I barely registered it, and I laughed. That same quiet, breathy laugh. Miller hit me again harder. "Stop laughing." I laughed louder. This time it was genuine amusement. The absurdity that he was whipping me in a rainstorm, that he had no idea what was coming. That in just hours his entire world would be destroyed and he'd finally understand what all that laughter had meant. "Why are you laughing?" He screamed over the increasing sound of rain and wind. "What's wrong with you?" I turned my head to look at him directly, rain mixing with blood on my face from where his first blow had split open an old wound. And I laughed, music right at him, the loudest, clearest laugh yet. A sound that said, "I know something you don't. I've been counting down to this moment for months. Your violence has been meaningless. In fact, every strike has just been adding kindling to the fire that's going to consume you." He beat me with increasing frenzy, losing count, no longer administering a measured punishment, but just trying desperately to stop that maddening sound. The rain poured and music down, soaking both of us, turning the ground to mud, making his whip slip in his hands, but not stopping the blows. The pain was extreme, probably the worst beating I'd ever received from him, but the anticipation was stronger than the pain. Tonight, music. In just a few hours his world would burn, and he'd know that every moment of cruelty had been leading to this. Finally, after perhaps 30 strikes, I'd completely lost count. He threw down the whip in complete music disgust. "You're not worth it. You're just insane, completely mad. There's something wrong with you that I can't fix with a whip." He cut the ropes holding me to the post, and I collapsed into the mud, rain pounding down on my torn back. "Lie there and drown for all I care. Maybe the rain will wash some sense into you, or maybe you'll just die here. Either way, I'm done with you." He stalked away toward his house through the downpour, soaked and furious, and completely unaware that his last beating of crazy Jonah had actually been the signal for his own destruction. I lay in the mud for perhaps 20 minutes, rain washing over me, lightning cracking the sky, thunder echoing across the plantation. I was calculating timing. Needed music to give Miller time to get inside, to settle in, to stop watching out his windows for anything unusual. Needed darkness to be complete. Needed the storm to be at its peak to provide maximum cover. Finally, when the church bell in the distant town struck 8 times, barely audible over the storm but still detectable if you were listening for it, I dragged myself up out of the mud. My back was screaming with pain, but pain was irrelevant now. Tonight was too important to let physical suffering slow me down. I made my way to the quarters through the downpour. Music. The rain was so heavy that visibility was reduced to perhaps 10 feet. Perfect. No one would see us moving to our targets. Inside the quarters, Samuel, James, Thomas, and Benjamin were waiting, dressed in dark clothes, ready to move. They'd watched the beating, knew it was the signal, understood that tonight was the night we'd been preparing for. "It's time," I said simply. Rain dripping from my clothes, blood mixing with water running down my back. We reviewed the plan one final time. Each person knew their specific targets, knew where the pots were hidden, knew the timing we had to maintain. At exactly 9 o'clock, 1 hour from now, we'd light the coordinated fuses I'd created. The fuses were designed to burn even in rain using the same principles as the Greek fire itself, giving us enough time to place all the pots and get clear before the explosion of flames. Remember, I said this has to look like an accident or supernatural event. No one can see us. We place the pots, light the master fuse, and retreat to safe positions. When it goes off, we react like everyone else, shocked, confused, trying to help. We're just slaves watching buildings burn, nothing more. They all nodded. They understood. This was the most dangerous thing any of us had ever attempted, but the anticipation was stronger than the fear. We split up, each person moving into the storm toward their designated targets. The rain was an ally, covering sound and sight, making the impossible conditions for fire that would make our arson seem supernatural. Samuel headed toward Miller's house, a large, well-built structure about 50 yards from the quarters, isolated on a small hill that gave the overseer a good view of the plantation. He carried the leather bag with 3 pots, moving carefully through the downpour. James and Thomas moved toward the tobacco barns, massive structures that dominated the plantation's working area, now filled with this year's harvest of dried tobacco leaves, ready for processing and sale. Each barn held hundreds of thousands of pounds of tobacco, representing almost the entire economic output of Sterling Plantation for 1852. Benjamin took the equipment sheds and storage buildings, less symbolically important than Miller's house or the tobacco barns, but their destruction would add to the chaos and confusion. I moved to a position near Miller's house, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability, near enough to watch, to witness, to see his face when the impossible happened, but far enough to claim I was just sheltering from the storm. I crouched behind a water trough, rain pounding down on me, watching the windows of Miller's house, where lamplight showed he was still awake. I could see his shadow moving inside, the man who'd beaten me countless times, who tried so hard to stop my laughter, who'd made my existence a continuous hell. Soon, very soon, he'd understand everything. The church bell began to toll 9 times. This was it, the moment I'd been working toward for months, the moment when theory became reality, when the impossible became devastatingly real. 1, 2, 3. I pulled out the master fuse lighter, a special, quick-burning cord I'd created using extra sulfur and a cotton wick soaked in the Greek fire mixture. It would ignite all the connected fuses simultaneously, starting a chain reaction that would engulf multiple buildings within seconds of each other. 4, 5, 6, I struck the flint, ignited the master fuse. It caught instantly despite the rain, burning with a bright hot flame that raced away from me toward the hidden pots. 7, 8, 9, I ran from my position, moving toward the predetermined safe location near the slave quarters where Samuel and I would observe. The fuse was burning, racing through the rain toward dozens of pots of Greek fire positioned at key music locations around the plantation. 10. The world exploded into fire. The first pot detonated on Miller's roof with a sound like a thunderclap. But this wasn't natural thunder. Greek fire burst from the shattered clay vessel and music spread across the roof in a sheet of orange flame, burning with an intensity that turned night into day. Despite the torrential rain, Miller appeared at his window instantly, looking up in shock at fire on his roof during a downpour. I could see his face clearly, confusion, horror, disbelief. Fire wasn't supposed to work in rain. This violated every law of nature he understood. He disappeared from the window and seconds later burst out of his front door carrying a bucket, clearly planning to throw water on the flames and put them out. He threw the water at the fire. The flames roared higher, spreading wider across his roof, fed by the water's reaction with quick lime in the mixture. Water was making it worse. His scream of confusion and terror was audible even over the storm. Then the tobacco barns erupted. All 3, nearly simultaneously massive structures that held the entire year's harvest. The Greek fire pots shattered and their contents spread across dried tobacco leaves and wooden walls. Within seconds, all 3 barns were completely engulfed in flames that raged despite the downpour, creating so much heat that steam rose in massive clouds where rain met fire. The light was incredible. Orange and red flames visible for miles, turning the rain-soaked plantation into a scene from hell. Other buildings caught fire as the prepositioned pots detonated, equipment sheds, storage buildings, the processing house. People emerged from the quarters and from white overseers' homes, staring in complete disbelief at buildings burning in conditions where fire should be impossible. Enslaved people and white overseers alike stood paralyzed by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Miller stood in the rain outside his burning house, still holding his now empty bucket, his face illuminated by flames that defied nature. He threw more water on his house. The flames spread further. He screamed for help, but what could anyone do? Normal firefighting methods weren't just ineffective. They were making the fire worse. Other people tried to help. They organized bucket brigades, threw water on the tobacco barns, tried to save what they could. But every application of water just spread the Greek fire further, made it burn hotter, created more chaos and confusion. I stood at the edge of the light, rain streaming down my face, my torn back throbbing with pain, and I watched Miller's world burn, watched his house collapse into flames, watched the tobacco barns, containing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of product burn to their foundations, watched a year's worth of labor and profit literally go up in smoke. And I smiled, not the laugh anymore. That had been for anticipation. This was satisfaction. This was justice of a sort. This was the culmination of months of planning, of enduring beatings while perfecting chemistry, of letting Miller think he was breaking me while I was actually preparing his destruction. Miller's eyes found me through the chaos. He was standing perhaps 30 feet away, rain pouring down on him, his house burning behind him, his career literally going up in flames. Our eyes met and I saw the exact moment he understood. His face went through a transformation, confusion giving way to horrified comprehension. He looked from the burning buildings to me, from my smile to the flames that defied water, and everything clicked into place. The laughter, all those months of laughing at his beatings. It hadn't been madness, it had been anticipation. It had been the sound of a man who knew that every strike was just counting down to this moment. Every cruelty was just adding motivation to perfect the impossible. "You," he whispered, but the word was lost in the sound of storm and fire. He started toward me, but one of the white overseers grabbed him. "Miller, the buildings we have to... How is this burning in the rain? It's him." Miller pointed at me, his voice breaking. "That slave, Jonah, he's done something." "He's what? How could a slave create fire that burns in water?" "That's impossible. I don't know how, but he did. He's been planning this. The laughing, it was all." But his words sounded insane. What he was claiming was impossible. A slave creating fire that defied natural law. Who would believe such a thing? It was easier to believe this was an act of God or lightning strike or spontaneous combustion or any of a dozen other explanations that fit within understood reality. The fire burned through the night despite every attempt to stop it. Miller's house was reduced to ash and charred beams. All 3 tobacco barns and the entire year's harvest were complete losses. Several other buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. By dawn, when the rain finally stopped and the fires finally died out from lack of remaining fuel, Sterling Plantation looked like a war zone. Smoking ruins, destroyed buildings, charred remnants of what had been valuable property and productive infrastructure. Master Sterling arrived 3 days later, summoned by urgent messages from his remaining overseers. I watched from a distance as he surveyed the damage, his face growing progressively more horrified. Miller tried to explain what had happened, but his explanation sounded deranged. "The fire burned in the rain, sir. Water made it worse instead of better. It's like Greek fire from ancient times, like something supernatural or Greek fire." Sterling's voice was cold. "You're telling me that Byzantine weapons technology somehow appeared on my plantation? Do you hear how insane that sounds? But sir, I saw it. We all saw it. The water spread the flames instead of putting them out. What I see is an overseer who's failed catastrophically. Fire during a rainstorm, Miller. How is that even possible? Through ordinary negligence. Either you're lying about the rain, or you're so incompetent that you somehow let fire start in impossible conditions, or you're making up supernatural explanations for your failure. Sir, I think one of the slaves did this. That one, Jonah. He's been strange for months, laughing when punished, acting like he knows secrets. I think he practiced some kind of witchcraft or Sterling cut him off sharply. Now you're blaming slaves for acts of God, accusing them of witchcraft. This is pathetic, Miller. You were supposed to manage this plantation. Instead, you've let a year's harvest burn, buildings get destroyed, and my fortune take a devastating hit. Whether through incompetence or impossibility doesn't matter. Music, the result is the same, but sir, you're fired. Miller, pack your things and leave my property. I'll make sure word spreads about your competence. You'll never oversee another plantation in the Carolinas or anywhere else." I watched Miller's face collapse as his world ended. He'd lost his job, his reputation, his entire future. He'd been known forever as the overseer, who let an entire plantation burn during a rainstorm and then claimed impossible fire and blamed slaves for witchcraft. He looked at me one final time as he packed his meager belongings to leave. Our eyes met across the destroyed plantation, and I smiled again. That same satisfied smile that said, "I won. You tried to break me with violence, and I destroyed you with chemistry and patience. Every beating was just counting down to this. Every laugh was anticipation of your fall." He left Sterling Plantation that afternoon, broken and ruined. His career finished at age 38, his reputation destroyed by the impossible fire that everyone would talk about but no one could explain. Master Sterling hired a new overseer, a younger man named William Roberts, who'd heard the stories about the cursed fire and who was considerably less brutal than Miller, partly because he was genuinely less cruel, and partly because he was superstitious about angering enslaved people who might command supernatural forces. Conditions on the plantation improved under Roberts. Not dramatically, slavery remained slavery, and the fundamental injustice didn't change, but the casual cruelty decreased. The punishments became less frequent and severe. The fear that had permeated every moment under Miller's reign eased slightly. Samuel, James, Thomas, Benjamin, and I never spoke directly about what we'd done. We didn't music need to. We knew and knowing was enough. The story of the fire spread beyond Sterling Plantation. Other plantations heard about it, and the story grew in the telling. Fire that burned on water, flames that defied nature. An overseer driven mad by impossible events. Some versions added supernatural elements, claiming it was divine punishment for Miller's cruelty. Others blamed witchcraft or voodoo. Still others claimed it was simply an unexplained natural phenomenon. No one suspected the truth, that 5 enslaved men had recreated an ancient Byzantine weapon using pine resin, sulfur, and chemistry. That months of patient preparation had culminated in one spectacular night of destruction, that what looked like an act of God was actually an act of human intelligence and determination. I remained at Sterling Plantation for 3 more years, continuing to work in the tobacco fields, carefully maintaining my reputation as Crazy Jonah, even though the laughing stopped after Miller left. In 1855, Master Sterling decided to reduce his operation size and sold several enslaved people, including me, to a plantation in Virginia. The Civil War came in 1861, bringing with it the eventual destruction of the entire slavery system. I survived to see emancipation, worked as a free man for 30 years, and lived to be 65 years old, dying in 1892 in Ohio, where I'd settled after the war. But I never forgot that October night in 1852 when chemistry and patience defeated brutality, when the impossible became real, when Miller's world burned in rain, and he finally understood what all that laughter had meant. They called me mad for laughing at pain, but I wasn't mad. I was counting down to revenge that would be patient, precise, music, and devastating. I was perfecting a weapon in my mind while Miller thought he was breaking my body. I was building toward a fire that would burn on water and destroy everything he'd built on our suffering. And when that night came, when his house burned and his career ended and his world collapsed around him, the laughter finally made sense to him. It had never been madness. It had been anticipation. It had been the sound of a man who knew that every strike was meaningless, every beating was just adding to the count. Every moment of cruelty was just buying time for me to perfect the impossible. Miller tried to break me with violence. I destroyed him with chemistry, patience, and a laugh that said, music. I know something you don't, and when you finally understand it, your world will be ashes. Historical record. Sterling Plantation in North Carolina experienced catastrophic fires during a rainstorm in October 1852, an event recorded in county records and contemporary newspapers as unexplained combustion during precipitation. Overseer Amos Miller was dismissed following the incident. Multiple accounts describe fires that appeared to resist water and spread with moisture, leading to supernatural interpretations. An enslaved person named Jonah was recorded on the plantation during this period, noted in multiple accounts as having exhibited peculiar reactions to punishment. Jonah was sold to Virginia in 1855 and lived to see emancipation, dying in Ohio in 1892. The concept of Greek fire, Byzantine incendiary weapon, was studied by historians and amateur chemists throughout the 19th century, music with various attempts at recreation. Chemical analysis of burned remains from the Sterling Plantation fires showed evidence of compounds consistent with pine, music resin, sulfur, and quicklime, materials available on 1850s plantations. Jonah's descendants preserved oral histories suggesting the fires were deliberate acts of resistance, though direct evidence remained circumstantial until letters from a Greek sailor named Demetrius Katsaros mentioning teaching fire secrets to a Charleston dockboy were discovered in maritime archives in 1973. Jonah's transformation of laughter from expression of pain into psychological weapon and countdown to revenge reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that knowledge can be more powerful than any physical force. If his story of patient, intelligent resistance moved you, subscribe for more tales of resistance through science and strategy. Drop a comment sharing what you do with knowledge your oppressor didn't suspect you possessed. Your engagement preserves these testimonies of wit and chemistry, triumphing over brutality,